Every man has a secret. Some wear it with pride, others hide it in silence. The old fisherman at the dock was one of those silent ones. No one noticed, until a Coast Guard officer spotted the faded tattoo on his weathered shoulder. Because some tattoos aren't just inked, they're earned. Every morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, Master Chief Special Warfare Operator Robert Hayes would arrive at Pier 7. Not in a flashy boat, not with expensive gear, just an old wooden fishing vessel named Silent Tide, patched more times than he could count. His routine was sacred: check the nets, inspect the engine, cast his line in the same spot where the water was deepest. The other fishermen called him Pops or the Quiet One. They thought he was just another retiree with too much time and too few friends. His clothes were simple: faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and a navy cap that had lost its color decades ago. His hands were scarred, his face lined with salt and time, but his movements, they carried weight. Precision, like muscle memory from another life. Hayes never fished for sport, never talked about his catch. He'd pull in just enough to sell at the local market, always the same modest amount. But the Coast Guard officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, had noticed something different. The way he read the water, the way he moved through the boat like every step was calculated, the way his eyes tracked the horizon not for fish, but for threats. She'd seen that look before. In her training videos, in the faces of special operations instructors who spoke in whispers about men who never returned from their missions. One foggy morning, as Hayes was repairing his nets, his shirt slipped just enough to reveal his left shoulder. Chen was walking by, coffee in hand, when she stopped mid-step. There, faded by decades of sun and salt, was a tattoo that made her blood run cold. Not a skull, not an anchor, not some flashy design. Just 3 numbers and a symbol, 187. Below it, barely visible, the words Operation Silent Tide. She knew that number. Everyone in Naval Special Warfare knew it. Operation Silent Tide, the classified 1987 mission to dismantle a drug cartel's maritime operation in the Caribbean. A mission that went dark. A mission where only one man was confirmed to have made it out alive. Hen's hand trembled as she approached. "Sir," she said quietly, "that tattoo, it's from Operation Silent Tide, isn't it?" Hayes didn't look up from his nets. His hands never stopped working. "Some things are better left in the past, Lieutenant." But Chen knew better. She'd read the files. The mission report was classified, but the casualty list wasn't. Hayes' name wasn't on it. Neither was his partner's, Petty Officer Marcus Webb, who had supposedly died in that operation. "Your Master Chief Hayes," she whispered. "The one who carried Webb out for 15 miles through shark-infested waters." This time, Hayes looked up. His eyes were tired, but they still held that fire. "I said some things are better left in the past." That afternoon, Chen couldn't let it go. She dug into the archives, found the declassified portions of Operation Silent Tide. The mission had been a disaster. 3 SEAL teams sent in to destroy a drug cartel's maritime operation. Only one man came out, Hayes. He'd carried his wounded partner for days, performed field surgery with nothing but a combat knife and fishing line, and disappeared into the jungle. The official report said Webb died of his injuries, but Hayes' silence told a different story. Chen, determined to uncover the truth, researched Hayes' past. Operation Silent Tide in 1987 had been planned to cut off the sea routes of a major drug cartel in the Caribbean. Hayes and his team were tasked with tracking the cartel's ships and destroying their operational center. When the operation began, everything had gone according to plan. Hayes and Webb had approached the target, but the cartel launched an unexpected attack. When gunfire erupted, Hayes had thrown himself over Webb to protect him. Both were wounded, but Hayes had carried Webb out of the forest on his shoulders. For 15 days, he had carried Webb through the jungle. No food sources, no water. Hayes had used his own clothes to bandage Webb's wounds. Lost in the forest, they had survived thanks to Hayes' navigation skills. At the end of the operation, Hayes and Webb had successfully completed their mission. The cartel's operational center was destroyed, but both were severely wounded. Webb had died from his injuries. Hayes, however, had been saved by carrying Webb. But Operation Silent Tide was just one chapter in Hayes' long and storied career. His service record read like a history of modern conflicts, each mission adding another layer to the man who now quietly fished at the dock. Vietnam, 1968 to 1969. Hayes' first taste of combat came in the jungles of Vietnam. As a young petty officer, he was assigned to a reconnaissance team operating deep in the Central Highlands. During Operation Swift Move, his unit was tasked with gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements near the DMZ. The mission went sideways when they stumbled upon a heavily fortified enemy position. Surrounded and outnumbered 10-1, Hayes' team faced annihilation. But Hayes, displaying the tactical brilliance that would define his career, orchestrated a fighting withdrawal that became legendary in SEAL training programs. When their radio was destroyed and extraction became impossible, Hayes led his men through 3 days of brutal jungle warfare. He personally carried 2 wounded teammates through minefields, using his intimate knowledge of jungle survival to keep them alive. His actions that week saved 8 lives and earned him his first Bronze Star. But the mission came at a cost. His best friend since BUD/S training, Petty Officer Tommy Red Rodriguez, didn't make it out. Hayes watched him bleed out in a makeshift aid station, holding his hand as he whispered about his newborn daughter back home. That loss would haunt Hayes for decades, shaping his quiet demeanor and his refusal to seek recognition. Panama, 1989. Operation Just Cause. 20 years later, Hayes found himself in Panama during Operation Just Cause. Now a seasoned chief petty officer, he was part of a joint task force tasked with neutralizing Manuel Noriega's elite security forces. During the assault on Rio Hato airfield, Hayes led a 4-man team in a daring nighttime infiltration. Their objective was to secure the airfield's control tower and prevent enemy aircraft from escaping. The operation required surgical precision. Any noise could alert the entire garrison. Hayes' team successfully breached the perimeter and reached the control tower undetected. But as they were setting charges on the communication equipment, enemy guards discovered them. What followed was a fierce firefight that lasted nearly an hour. In the chaos, Hayes' radioman, Petty Officer Jenkins, was critically wounded by shrapnel. With enemy reinforcements closing in, Hayes made a decision that would define his character. He ordered his team to complete the mission while he stayed behind to evacuate Jenkins. For the next 2 hours, Hayes fought a running battle through the airfield, dragging Jenkins behind cover, returning fire with one hand while applying a tourniquet with the other. When a helicopter finally arrived for extraction, Hayes refused to board until Jenkins was safely aboard. His actions that night prevented enemy aircraft from escaping and earned him the Silver Star. But Jenkins didn't survive the flight to the field hospital. Hayes would later learn that a blood clot from his wounds had killed him during transport. Another friend lost, another name added to the list of men Hayes carried in his heart. Iraq, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom. In the deserts of Iraq, Hayes was part of a specialized unit tasked with hunting high-value targets in the early days of the invasion. Now a senior chief, he was one of the most experienced operators in theater. During Operation Desert Spear, Hayes led a mission to capture an Iraqi intelligence officer believed to be orchestrating attacks against coalition forces. The target was holed up in a fortified compound in Fallujah, protected by a small army of loyalists. The assault began at dawn. Hayes' team approached the compound under cover of darkness, using thermal imaging to identify guard positions. But as they breached the perimeter, they discovered the compound was a trap. The intelligence officer had fled days earlier, leaving behind only a skeleton crew and enough explosives to level the building. What Hayes didn't know was that among the defenders was Lieutenant Kareem al-Rashid, an Iraqi officer who had trained with American Special Forces years earlier. The two men had a brief, tense conversation through a broken window before the firefight began, a surreal moment where former allies found themselves on opposite sides of a gun barrel. The battle lasted 6 hours. Hayes personally neutralized 3 enemy positions, using his knowledge of urban warfare to outmaneuver defenders who knew the building better than he did. When the dust settled, Hayes' team had captured crucial intelligence that led to the dismantling of an entire terrorist network. But the victory came at a price. His team leader, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, no relation to the Coast Guard officer, was killed by a sniper's bullet while trying to rescue a wounded Marine. Hayes held her as she died, promising to tell her family about her courage. It was another promise he would spend years trying to keep. Afghanistan, 2009, Operation Enduring Freedom. Hayes' final combat deployment came in the mountains of Afghanistan. At 58, he was one of the oldest active operators in theater, but his experience made him invaluable to younger SEALs learning the ropes. During Operation Mountain Shadow, Hayes was tasked with training an Afghan National Army unit in counterinsurgency tactics. But when Taliban forces ambushed a convoy carrying humanitarian aid, Hayes volunteered to lead the rescue mission. The operation took place in the treacherous terrain of the Hindu Kush, where altitude sickness and hypothermia were as dangerous as enemy fire. Hayes' team had to rappel from helicopters onto a narrow ledge, then fight their way up a 2,000-foot cliff face to reach the ambush site. What made the mission particularly challenging was Hayes' insistence on minimizing civilian casualties. The Taliban had positioned themselves in a village, using the local population as human shields. Hayes spent hours coordinating with Afghan forces to evacuate civilians before launching the assault. The battle lasted 18 hours. Hayes personally rescued 12 civilians, including 5 children, while his team neutralized the Taliban fighters. But among those fighters was a young man who reminded Hayes of his own son, the same age, the same intensity in his eyes. Hayes would later admit that killing him was the hardest shot he'd ever taken. The mission's success led to the capture of 3 Taliban commanders and the rescue of the aid convoy. Hayes was recommended for the Navy Cross, but as with many of his decorations, he declined the award, citing the loss of civilian life during the operation. After Webb's death in Operation Silent Tide, Hayes had done many things to keep his memory alive. He had contacted Webb's family and told them about Webb's heroism. He had attended Webb's funeral and said his final goodbye to him. Hayes had had a headstone made for Webb's memory. The headstone was engraved with Webb's name and the word hero. Hayes would place flowers on this headstone every year on the anniversary of Webb's death. But Webb wasn't the only ghost that haunted Hayes. Rodriguez from Vietnam, Jenkins from Panama, Martinez from Iraq, the young Taliban fighter from Afghanistan, their faces appeared in his dreams, their voices in his memories. Each loss had shaped him, each death a weight he carried into retirement. Hayes' inner world had been shaped by these losses. The memories they shared, the adventures they lived, the time they spent together had become a burden carrying their spirits. That's why every morning when he came to the dock and prepared his boat, he felt like he was on a mission with them. Every shot, every movement, seemed to be done in their memory. The next morning, Chen arrived at the dock early. Hayes was already there, preparing his boat. She didn't approach. Instead, she watched as he cast his line in the exact same spot, the same way, every day. But now she understood. Every morning, Hayes wasn't just fishing. He was watching, waiting, protecting. The same precision, the same vigilance that had kept him alive in the jungle years ago. When Hayes' boat docked, Chen sat beside him. Both stared toward the horizon without saying anything. Finally, Chen whispered, "One day, when you meet someone who remembers your service, don't forget to thank them." Hayes nodded slightly. "They didn't do it for me to thank them. I just carried them." And that day, the dock workers wrote Hayes' name on the board, reserved for silent heroes. Hayes didn't notice it, and he didn't ask them to take it down. Some men teach with words, others teach by presence. Hayes never told war stories, never raised his voice, never asked for a thank you. He showed up, took 30 shots, and left more impact than most men who speak for hours. Hayes continued to come to the dock every morning. No one knew his past. No one knew he was a hero. But Chen knew Hayes' past. She respected Hayes. She thanked Hayes. Hayes continued his silent heroism. No one knew his past. No one knew he was a hero. But Chen knew Hayes' past. She respected Hayes. She thanked Hayes. And this way, Hayes' story continued forever. Silently, heroically, unforgettable. Now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Hayes? A veteran who never bragged, never boasted, just stood quietly, carried history in his hands, and let time forget until someone remembered. Say their name in the comments, share their story, let others know who they were before the silence. Because at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful stories don't shout, they wait. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, subscribe, share, and help us keep these voices alive. We'll see you in the next one. And until then, if you ever see an old man quietly fishing at the dock, watch his movements. You might be standing next to